So last week, finished up muscles, which was thrilling. Now we're on to the elbow, forearm, wrist, and hand. So we're going to kind of bounce around a little bit between the two lab sheets. So we're going to run through all the bony landmarks on lab 3 that are on basically all of page 1 and then the top of page 2. And then ideally, we're going to get into the muscles of the elbow complex. So we'll do kind of that first part of lab 4 today. So that's kind of where we're at. And so in remaking this slideshow over the summer, what I essentially did was went back through and tried to cover everything in the elbow first and then get into the forearm and then get into the wrist, because the way the two labs are set up, they kind of mishmash them. So we'll do elbow first and then move on. All right. And the other thing I'm going to try to do, kind of like we did when we first talked about the shoulder, is all this stuff is up in the slideshow, including netter drawings, which are posted in Canvas. So rather than just reading you the netter drawing, I'm going to show you how to find all this stuff in the anatomy app, because then it doesn't look like I'm just reading to you. All right, so the elbow complex. So there's 3 bones involved in the elbow complex, one of which you've heard of before. So the first bone is obviously the humerus. So that's your upper arm bone, as you know. So with the shoulder, we talked about the proximal aspect of the humerus, so up by your shoulder, obviously. Now we're moving on to the distal aspect of the humerus. And then the other 2 bones are the radius and the ulna. So those are your 2 forearm bones. So remember, we're always going to do things in anatomical position, and that's going to be really important when we talk about the bones of the forearm and the hand. So remember, anatomical position, palms facing forward, so your thumb is facing laterally. So in that position, your radius is the lateral of the 2 bones. So of your forearm bones, the radius is the one that joins your thumb, and so that's the lateral bone. The ulna is the one that is on the pinky side of your hand, and that's the medial bone. And where that becomes confusing is if you flip your hand over, now the radius is on the medial aspect, right? So you don't want to do anything in pronation. So I'm always going to talk about stuff from the point of view of supination. So radius is lateral, ulna is medial, radius is on the thumb side, ulna is on the pinky side. So those are your 2 forearm bones. In terms of the structure of the radius and the ulna, so they kind of flip jobs. So at the elbow, the ulna is the more important of the 2. So the ulna has a really obvious hook to it, the trochlear notch, that's actually going to wrap around the humerus, and that helps stabilize the primary joint of the elbow, which is the humeral ulnar joint. So at the elbow, the ulna is fairly large, and then as it goes down toward the wrist, as we work distally, it's going to taper and be fairly small. So the ulna doesn't really do much at the wrist. The radius is kind of the opposite. So the elbow, the radius is fairly small. It doesn't do much to ensure joint stability, but then down the wrist, the radius is actually quite wide. It takes up most of the space of your wrist. And so the primary joint of the wrist is called the radiocarpal joint. So the radius is the more important of the 2 at the wrist. So they kind of flip jobs. Ulna important at the elbow, radius is important down there at the wrist. All right, so let's look at the lab 3 sheet and let's talk about bony landmarks. So obviously starting here on the skeleton. So I'm going to do is zoom in on his right side, because again, we'll try to keep things on the right. Zoom in really close. And then move him over. All right. So the first thing on there is the medial supracondylar ridge. So just a couple things to make that make a little bit more sense. So sometimes different books will talk about the condyles of the humerus. And so the condyles are down here. We're going to use different terms for them. But the reason I mentioned the condyles of the humerus is if we're talking about supracondylar, that means above the condyles, right? The supracondylar ridge has to be a ridge, and there are 2 of them, has to be a ridge above those condyles. So the medial aspect obviously is closer to the midline. So this is the medial aspect of the humerus. So then all of this is that medial supracondylar ridge. And unfortunately, I started with something that's super boring. There's not really a lot that happens at the medial one. So that's what it is, and there aren't really any significant things about it other than, like I said, the name, supracondylar, above the condyles. The next thing on there is the medial epicondyle. So the medial epicondyle, now we've got some action. So this big obvious knob here is the medial epicondyle. And in you, it's really easy to find. If you look at the inside of your elbow, flex your arm a little bit, there's a pretty obvious knob right there. That's your medial epicondyle. And so there's a lot that's going on there. The one thing I want to make sure that you know is that the wrist flexor, F-L-E-X-O-R, wrist flexor and pronator group originates there. And pronator is P-R-O-N-A-T-O-R, pronator. So the wrist flexor pronator group originates there. What's that look like? So if you are standing in anatomical position and you bring the palm of your hand closer to the anterior aspect of your forearm, that's wrist flexion. So it's kind of the opposite of the way you catch yourself when you fall. And then we all know what pronation is. That's when you take your palms from facing forward and then just rotate at the forearm, so flip your hands over, and that's pronation. So the group of muscles that does flexion and pronation originates there at the medial epicondyle. The ulnar collateral ligament also originates there. We'll talk about that guy in some detail here in a second. So the medial epicondyle is a pretty important landmark. Another interesting thing about the medial epicondyle, right behind it, so if you're able to find your big bony knob earlier, if you go just behind it or just posterior to it, you'll find a little cord-like structure, especially if you're kind of in about 60 degrees of flexion like I am right now. You feel a little cord back there. That's your ulnar nerve. And so you can tap on that and it'll make your fourth and fifth fingers tingle, right? And that's the more colloquial name for that, your funny bone, right? Because you've all slammed your elbow at some point, like your hand went numb, especially your fourth and fifth fingers. So that's your funny bone, is right there behind your medial epicondyle. And the actual name for your funny bone is your ulnar nerve. So that's the medial epicondyle. And now, let's zoom in just a little more. So the next thing on there, we're going to move laterally. And the next thing is the trochlea. And so the trochlea is this area. It's kind of that medial aspect of the distal humerus. And so it's hard to see here. On the actual bones in lab, it's pretty obvious, but it kind of looks like a spindle. You know what thread sits on? If you've ever seen a spool of thread, it kind of looks like that, right? So there's a really obvious ridge right here that I'm mousing over. There's kind of an indentation here, and then there's another really obvious ridge. So all of this is the trochlea. And that's actually, I'll click on this one because it's easier to see on the netter drawing. So you can see that he's got a little more contrast here. And so all of this is the trochlea. And I mentioned the condyles, so you can see all of this is the medial condyle, and again, all of this is the lateral condyle. So your supracondylar ridges are up here. All right, so the trochlea then, the significance of it, so again, all of this is the trochlea. The significance of the trochlea is that it articulates with or interacts with the ulna. So the ulna is going to slide around the trochlea to form the primary hinge joint of the elbow, which is the humero-ulnar joint. So that's the important thing to know about the trochlea. I don't really have a good way to remember that other than trochlea. It kind of sounds like ulna. Trochlea, ulna, those two go together. I don't know if that helps you. And if you know a better way, I'm happy to hear it. So that's the trochlea there. And then the next thing on there is the coronoid fossa. So the coronoid fossa, remember anytime you got a fossa, you have an indentation. So the coronoid fossa tells you actually what goes into that fossa. So the coronoid fossa is this little indentation just above the trochlea. Because on the ulna, you can see this little point right here. That's called the coronoid process. And so when you fully flex your elbow, which is to bend your elbow, that coronoid process on the ulna falls into the coronoid fossa on the humerus, process into the fossa. And so that's why that's there. So it gives you a few more degrees of elbow flexion. If you didn't have that little indentation, that fossa on the humerus, you'd lose a couple degrees because the bones would be bumping up against each other earlier. So we get some more range of motion out of that little coronoid fossa. Next thing on there is the capitulum. So not super obvious here, but like I said, you'll see it when we get to the bones in lab. But all of this lateral portion of the distal humerus, so all this area, that's your capitulum. So the capitulum is shaped very much like a golf ball. And so like I said, if you play with one of the plastic humerus models in lab, you'll see a really obvious golf ball shape down the lateral aspect. So the thing to know about the capitulum, it interacts with or articulates with the radius. The capitulum and the head of the radius go together. And then the lateral epicondyle, so continuing to move laterally. So the lateral epicondyle is this little bump right here. So it's not super obvious. So again, the medial epicondyle is this really obvious bump right here. The lateral epicondyle, less obvious, but basically just go to the lateral aspect of the bone across from the medial epicondyle. It's that. The lateral epicondyle, another fairly important structure. So there you have the origin of another two groups of muscles, and they're the opposites of the ones that we talked about at the medial epicondyle. So if at the medial epicondyle you've got the wrist flexor group, then at the lateral epicondyle you have the wrist extensor group. So the lateral epicondyle is the origin of the wrist extensor. And what's the opposite of pronation? Supination, good. So the wrist extensor supinator group originates there at the lateral epicondyle. So both of those two epicondyles, if either the wrist flexor or extensor group gets inflamed, you can get irritation and inflammation there. So in the case of the medial epicondyle, we'll talk about that coming up with kids. That's where little league elbow occurs. It's one of the conditions that's grouped into little league elbow occurs with the medial epicondyle. The lateral epicondyle is a condition you're probably more familiar with, tennis elbow. People have probably at least heard of it. And so tennis elbow is the result of repetitive wrist extension. And basically, you just overload that wrist extensor muscle group, and they get inflamed at their origin there at the lateral epicondyle. And so it's the technical term is lateral epicondylitis, because an itis is an inflammation. And so that's your tennis elbow. Office workers get it too. Like I know my mother-in-law, when she was doing a lot of secretarial kind of work, just from typing all day, like always had a wrist or a forearm brace that she would wear to take some pressure off of those muscle bellies. So you get it sometimes with office work that's really repetitive as well. So that's the lateral epicondyle. And then we have that lateral supracondylar ridge is right there. So the lateral supracondylar ridge is a little more exciting. So I skipped one, sorry. So that's the second one from the bottom is the lateral supracondylar ridge. A little more exciting than the medial. There are two muscles that originate there. One of them is brachioradialis. So brachioradialis is one of the ones on lab sheet 4. It's the third one down, if you're looking at both lab sheets. So brachioradialis originates there, that lateral supracondylar ridge, as does extensor carpi radialis longus. The abbreviation is ECRL, extensor carpi radialis longus, and that's also on that sheet. Where is that one? It is on lab sheet 4. It's the first one on the second table, extensor carpi radialis longus. So originates there at that lateral supracondylar ridge. So both of those are there. Skip the radial fossa. Should probably go back to that. So the radial fossa is a little indentation just above the capitulum. So again, can't see it super well here, but there's a little indentation just above the capitulum, and that serves the same function as the coronoid fossa. So the radial head, which is this, whenever we fully flex the elbow, the radial head is going to fall into that radial fossa. So again, contributes to a few more degrees of elbow flexion. And then the last thing is the olecranon fossa. And one of my great joys in this class is listening to everyone try to pronounce olecranon about a week from now. So the olecranon fossa. So this part of your ulna, that big knob, so whenever you flex your elbow, that big knob there, that's your olecranon of your ulna. And so then the olecranon fossa is where that falls into. I actually have to hide my ulna, make that go away. And so this really obvious, really big indentation in the back or on the posterior aspect of the humerus, that's your olecranon fossa. Because, so the olecranon, if I unhide it, let's bring that guy back. So you'll see if I look at the medial aspect, so you can see how it forms that big hook there with the ulna. And so that indentation there, that posterior aspect of the olecranon slides into the olecranon fossa, and then that gives me a few more degrees of elbow extension. So that's what allows me to fully straighten my arm, is that indentation on the humerus. The other thing is that promotes stability. So you've got greater surface area contact between those two bones. So now you have a more stable joint at the humeral ulnar joint. All right, so that's the humerus. So now let's talk about the ulna. Actually, let me zoom in a little bit. And let's isolate the ulna, because why not? All right, so obviously looking at the right ulna, anterior view there. Click off of that, or not. All right. So first one on there, we talked about the olecranon. So again, I'm going to rotate it. You're actually going to look at a posterior view, or medial view in this case. So now you're looking at the medial aspect of the right ulna. So all of this is the olecranon. And again, just for practical purposes, if you flex your elbow, if you bend your elbow, and there's that obvious bump there, that's your olecranon. So that's it. Then we got the trochlear notch. So this sort of half moon shape here is the trochlear notch. And so again, the ulna articulates with the trochlea of the humerus. And so the trochlear notch, that C shape, fits up against the trochlea of the humerus. And so that's what forms that primary hinge joint of the elbow, the humeral-ulnar joint, the interaction of the trochlear notch and the trochlea. Then we got the coronoid process. So we're going to go back to an anterior view. So I'm going to rotate it a little bit. So this little ridge right here, that is your coronoid process. So all of this ridge is the coronoid process. Again, that's going to fall into that coronoid fossa on the humerus whenever you flex the elbow. And so that projection, again, allows for more surface area contact between the ulna and the humerus, so promotes joint stability in terms of significance. The radial notch of the ulna is this little guy right here. And so when you play with the plastic bones, it's actually not that small. It's a pretty obvious notch right there. And so the radial head is going to sit there against that radial notch of the ulna, and that's going to form the radial ulnar joint, or at least the proximal radial ulnar joint. And at the radial ulnar joint, that's where you get pronation supination. So the radial head is going to spin against the ulna at that radial notch of the ulna. And if you ever have to do right and left in the humerus, or sorry, in the ulna, that's actually one of the more important landmarks. That radial notch, because the radius is on the lateral aspect of the arm, that radial notch has to face laterally. So if you got to do right and left, radial notch faces laterally, olecranon's in the back. Now you know whether you're on the right or the left side with that ulna. And then the ulnar tuberosity. So the tuberosity is kind of this area, it's not super obvious here, but it's an area just distal to the coronoid process that's kind of rough. So it's kind of this area here. That's the ulnar tuberosity. The brachialis muscle inserts there. The brachialis, which is the third muscle down on the first table on lab 4. Oh, sorry, second muscle down. It's brachialis. So that muscle inserts there. It also inserts into the coronoid process. So that's the significance there. And then the last thing is the ulnar styloid. So the ulnar styloid is distal. So you can go down here. I'm actually going to rotate the view a little bit, if I can zoom in some. There we go. So the ulnar styloid, whoops, didn't mean to do that. There you go. So this little bump right there, that's the ulnar styloid. So the ulnar styloid is pretty obvious. So if you kind of squeeze on your wrist, you'll find a little knob there on the pinky side. So mine's right there. It's more on the posterior aspect than it is really on the medial aspect. So that's where your ulnar styloid sits. All right. So that's the ulna. And then let's go back and talk about the radius. All right, so again, the radius is the lateral of the two. Not a ton of landmarks you got to know there. Click on it. So now we're highlighting the right thing. Let's do the whole bone. There we go. Okay. So in terms of landmarks on the radius, the first one is the radial head. So the radial head is all of this. And again, the radial head is what's going to articulate with the notch, the radial notch on the ulna. So the radial head is there. One of the things you'll see when you see the actual bones in the lab is that the interaction or intersection between the humerus and the radius looks a lot like a golf ball with the capitulum and then golf tee with the radial head. So those two are pretty obvious structures. And then where the neck, where it narrows a little bit is the neck. So this area just distal to the head, that's the neck of the radius. And then we have the radial tuberosity, or tuberosity of the radius. You'll see it written both ways. So the tuberosity of the radius is right here. And it's a really obvious rough area on the bone. So that's the tuberosity of the radius. What is the significance of that? We've actually talked about the tuberosity of the radius before. Anybody remember? What muscle inserts there? Good, yeah, biceps brachii. So that's a landmark I like to ask about. Biceps brachii inserts there at the tuberosity of the radius. So remember we talked about biceps tears, and most commonly, like in strength sports, you get distal biceps tears. And so what happens is it pulls away from that tuberosity of the radius there and then rolls up on itself. So it pulls away from that insertion point. And we talked about that they could basically drill a hole in your radius and kind of run some threading through there. That's where they're going to drill a hole. So that's your tuberosity of the radius. And then the radial styloid is distal. So we're going to go down here. So the radial styloid is this little projection here. So just like the ulnar styloid, a little projection off of the distal aspect of the bone. Again, in you, pretty easy to find if you kind of squeeze on your wrist, like my radial styloid right there. That's a pretty obvious little point there in your wrist. And then the last thing is the dorsal or Lister's tubercle. It's on the posterior aspect of the distal radius. So I got to flip him around and look at his backside now. Go this way. There we go. All right, so I'm going to center him some and rotate him a little bit. So there's a really obvious ridge and rough area there on the distal aspect of the posterior radius. And so it's kind of in through here. That is the dorsal or Lister's tubercle. So a few things. One that's kind of fun to find. So if you find your lateral epicondyle, so it's easy to find when your elbow is kind of about in 90 degrees of flexion, you'll find a pretty obvious ridge there. So that's your lateral epicondyle. Once you're on that, slide distal just a little bit. You should feel a little bit of a drop, and sometimes if you flex your elbow more, it becomes more obvious. But there's a little bit of a drop, and then there's a kind of a bony ridge there. That's your radial head. To know if you're actually on it, if you pronate and supinate your forearm, you'll feel your radial head spin underneath your fingers, which I always thought was kind of cool. Like, oh, there goes that radius. And then so that humeroradial joint is that gap between the two. So that's where that is. And then the dorsal tubercle, it's kind of like, so if you find your radial styloid, so again, it's a pretty obvious little projection there, and then come medially, there's a really obvious ridge or bump right there in the middle of your posterior wrist. So mine's right there. That's your dorsal tubercle. So some of your wrist extensor tendons kind of split around that. So that's why that's there. It's really useful for telling anterior and posterior aspects of the radius. That's kind of the primary thing we do with that. All right, so there's all of our bony landmarks. Now, let's go back to the slideshow. Talked about all that stuff. All right, let's talk about the joints. So the elbow joint complex includes three joints. Includes the humero-ulnar joint, the humero-radial joint, and then the proximal radial-ulnar joints. There's three joints that are included. The primary, so these two that are on there, the humero-ulnar and the humero-radial, are part of the primary joints of the elbow, I guess. Let's back that up. Let's go with this. Humero-ulnar is the primary hinge joint of the elbow. So the interaction between the trochlear and the trochlear notch, that's what really stabilizes the elbow. So that forms the hinge joint of the elbow, is the humero-ulnar joint. So later on the slideshow, you'll see a lot of HU. That's humero-ulnar. That's that hinge joint of the elbow where you get flexion and extension. The humero-radial joint is really just kind of along for the ride because there's a pretty obvious joint space there that we just found. So flexion and extension do technically occur there, but it's, like I said, it's just along for the ride. It's a sort of side player. So the joint capsule for the elbow includes, it encapsulates all three of those joints. And you can see the joint capsule pictured there. Again, 2 layers to this capsule, just like the other ones we talked about. But it's going to encapsulate, like I said, all three. In addition to that, we've got some important stabilizing ligaments. So now what you're looking at is the medial aspect of the right elbow. And so one of the important stabilizing ligaments is called the ulnar collateral ligament, or UCL is the abbreviation there. So the ulnar collateral ligament. So the UCL, and you can see that, so that if you're looking for the spelling is here. So there's your ulnar collateral ligament. It has 2 bands. So there's an anterior band here, and then a posterior band back here. So the anterior band is the one, so it is taut or tight in full flexion of the elbow, so the arm fully bent, full extension of the elbow, and then again, kind of around 60 degrees of flexion is really where it's fairly tight, so kind of in here. There. So about there. So with your arm not fully straight, not at a 90-degree angle, but just go a little bit less than that. So there your UCL is pretty tight. The posterior aspect or posterior band of the UCL is tightest when your elbow is in full flexion. And so what the UCL resists, both the anterior and posterior bands, is what's called a valgus force. So valgus force is one that pushes from the lateral aspect to the medial. So if you like land on your elbow with your arm in extension, something pushes you from lateral to medial, that's your UCL that's going to resist that force because it's a static stabilizer, just like we talked about with the shoulder ligaments. So the UCL limits valgus forces or abduction of the forearm, keeps your forearm from being pulled away from your humerus. And then on the lateral aspect, we have a radial collateral ligament, or an RCL is the abbreviation there. So the radial collateral ligament, this part I don't care that you know, but it does have two separate bands. One of them runs to the radius and one of them actually runs, so they both originate at the lateral epicondyle. One runs to the radius, one runs to the ulna. But you can see those bands split here. So there's that radial band and then there's that ulnar band. So the radial collateral ligament limits the opposite force that the UCL does. So it limits what's called a varus force. So varus is V-A-R-U-S. And a varus force is one that pushes from medial to lateral, so going this way. So medial to lateral, pushing your arm out or pushing your elbow out. And then the last ligament that's separate from the capsule is called the annular ligament. And so the annular ligament only has one end for whatever reason, but the annular ligament is there. And so the annular ligament, what it does is holds the head of the radius up against the ulna. And so when we were just doing pronation, supination, and spinning our radius around our ulna, it was the annular ligament that was holding the radius in place. So it wraps all the way around the radial head and secures it against the ulna. That's the job of the annular ligament. So the annular ligament is pretty uncommonly injured. So with that one, you see that injury most commonly in little kids. So sometimes kids will get an elbow dislocation or a humeral radial dislocation to be more specific. And what happens there is in a little kid, so 4 or 5 years old, sometimes their parents will kind of jerk on their arm or something like that, or they're walking the dog and the dog takes off. But when that happens, that sudden traction, so pulling on their arm really hard, can actually slide the radius out from underneath that annular ligament and effectively dislocate their elbow. And the reason you can do that is because their ligaments have a little more laxity, they have a little more stretchiness than y'all's do, because you're almost all skeletal immature. And their bones aren't quite as calcified, so they're a little squishier, if you will. And so the radial head compresses more easily, plus the ligament's more lax, and so it can slide right out from underneath that. So like I said, called nursemaid's elbow from somebody watching a kid basically yanking on them. All right, so movements at the humeral ulnar and humeral radial joints. So you got flexion extension. So again, flexion is just bending your elbow, extension is just straightening your elbow. So if I ask you, actually all the questions are going to be multiple choice, so I'm always going to say humeral ulnar when I'm referring to flexion extension. When the questions are multiple choice, if people say humeral radial for flexion extension, I give them credit. But again, the better answer is humeral ulnar. All right, so to break things up a little bit, I got a case study for you. So, case study I have for you is that you're going to pretend that you're an athletic trainer, physical therapist, whatever you want to be, osteopath. And a baseball pitcher comes to you complaining of elbow pain. So let's start with that. So you got a we'll call him a minor league baseball pitcher, comes to you complaining of elbow pain. What kind of questions would you want to ask this guy that says, hey, my elbow hurts? Yep.
How long do you feel discomfort?
Great question. So we're going to say that it's late in the minor league baseball season and it's a normal year, so it's probably August. And so this pain has been going on for several months. Fine? There is. Yep, it's a good question. So where does it hurt? And it hurts right there, and he points directly to the medial epicondyle. And a little bit maybe posterior to the medial epicondyle, but kind of in this general area. What else do you want to know? I know you're not all future athletic trainers, but general questions. Where does it hurt? what type of pain is it? How bad is the pain? What makes it better or worse? Yep. Yep. So he can. So he can flex and extend. It does hurt kind of in this mid-range of flexion. And what he's going to tell you is that it hurts pitching, and it's gotten progressively worse over the course of the season. The backstory on this guy is that he thinks he's got a shot at the big leagues because he's a minor leaguer. And so he's had some elbow pain, but he's like, I got to make it to the big leagues this year, so I'm just going to fight through it. So he's iced his elbow after games. He's done kind of some range of motion stuff. He's done some gripping stuff like with Rice, those kinds of things, to try to keep it loose. He's done some forearm flexion strengthening. And that's basically, he's kept it together, but it's been getting progressively worse. Yep.
I can't remember exactly what it was called. I think when he had it was isn't it? We just talked about it earlier.
He probably has that going on too. So he may have some inflammation of the wrist flexor tendons. That's probable. Really good thought. What else? So he's going to tell you that as he pitches, so the worst pain is all the way at the very back of the windup. So when his arm goes into full external rotation and he changes from the windup phase to the acceleration phase, they call it the cocking phase to the acceleration phase. So when his arm goes from full external rotation and starts to come into internal rotation to accelerate the ball, that's the worst pain, really sharp pain there in his medial elbow. And as you've probably seen from what we talked about with the shoulder, that's kind of the worst pain for a number of different conditions, whether we're talking about like some bicep issues, some labrum issues in the shoulder, elbow issues, that changeover is sort of the worst part of the motion. So we're going to say, okay, I don't really know what's going on. Why don't you go out and pitch today? We'll see what happens. While he pitches, suddenly he throws a crazy wild pitch and he grabs his elbow in obvious pain. So when you get out there, really obvious searing pain right there on the medial aspect of his elbow. What did he just do? It does. Okay, which ligament sits there? Yeah, he tore his UCL. Yeah, and so basically what happened is that repetitive throwing motion, every time you do that, that's going to stretch that UCL out a little bit, right? And so if you're doing that for months at a time, baseball season, even minor league baseball, they play, 120 games? Now, obviously, starting pitchers don't pitch every day. They pitch every fifth day, but still, it's a pretty high volume of throwing. And so he has progressively stretched out that ligament. His elbow is a little bit less stable because what happens is as you stretch out that ligament, now those wrist flexor muscles have to become overactive to try to stabilize the joint so they can become inflamed secondary to stretching out that ligament. So those two conditions oftentimes go together. The other thing that he would tell you that I forgot to tell you is that he has tingling and numbness in his fourth and fifth fingers, right? So now we've got some ulnar nerve involvement, your funny bone, because every time you go to throw, that instability of that ligament is going to allow extra movement between the ulna and the humerus. And so it's going to stretch out your UCL there on the inside of your elbow. And so then when you stretch a nerve, then that causes the nerve to fire when it shouldn't. And so that's what causes that tingling and numbness in those fourth and fifth fingers. So it's a really common presentation of the symptoms leading up to a UCL tear. It probably would have been like, let's shut it down. Maybe, really, if you're high-level minor league pitcher, maybe we get an MRI, look at it, and maybe we consider Tommy John surgery now. Because what's going to end up happening is that after he ruptures it, so typically they tear the anterior band. So like 87%, I think, of the tears are anterior band tears, and they're almost always mid-substance, so right here in the middle of the ligament. And then like another 10% are here where it inserts into the ulna. And so what they do, the surgery is one you've probably all heard of. It's called Tommy John surgery. And so what they do is they actually take, usually it's a tendon called the palmaris longus. Your palmaris longus is one where if you extend your fingers and flex your wrist a little bit, there's a really obvious tendon that pokes up. That's your palmaris longus. And so what they'll do is they'll take the palmaris longus from the other side, they'll take part of that tendon, and then they'll do this little figure of 8 technique where they drill a hole in the medial epicondyle and the proximal ulna, and then they just make a little 8 out of that ligament, or out of that tendon. It now becomes your ligament. The other thing is they can take a hamstring tendon, and then they can also take the tendon of your fourth toe, which is an interesting one. I don't know why the fourth, but that's usually the one that they take. So any of those will work. And so then that tendon becomes your new ligament. One of the interesting things about Tommy John surgery, so Tommy John was the pitcher. It's named for him, not for the physician who did it. His name is Job. But oftentimes with ligament replacements, the athletes aren't quite the same when they come back. You know, so if somebody tears their ACL, usually they can get pretty close to themselves, but oftentimes they're not quite the same running back or they're not quite the same athlete they were before the injury. With UCL surgeries, though, oftentimes they can actually throw harder. So it's unusual in terms of medical repairs. Usually, you're not better than you were originally after a repair. Yep.
When someone has like a replacement or like the recovery time is always that long, so like Tommy John is probably like a year, right?
Typical recovery window is 10 to 16 months for Tommy John surgery. Yeah.
So like all recoveries like that is that long?
Oftentimes, yeah. And ACL, because that's kind of like the non-throwing sport analog is an ACL tear if you're a running athlete. And so ACLs have been getting shorter. They were, like 18 months, and then more like 12. And now there's some 6-month protocols. But I was reading a research study the other day that if you returned to play in less than 9 months after an ACL tear, I think your chances of re-tearing it were like double. So the faster you get back, the more likely you are to tear it. So I'm not sure about UCL repairs, but I kind of wonder if it's the same thing, where if you're on that like 8-9 month part of the time window, if you're not going to tear it again. Because if you follow the Brewers, some of those guys like Jimmy Nelson or like Corey Knebel, like they're at a long time. Like you almost forget they're still on the roster, and it's like, oh, he's out there again. I forgot he was on our team. So yeah, it's a long turnaround for those.
So things like this tendon here, and you put in your elbow, does it affect like your wrist at all?
So that's a pretty little muscle, and actually one of the fun facts about palmar long is I think only 80% of people have it. And so it's one you can do without, because there are a lot of other really larger, stronger little wrist flexor muscles, and so it doesn't do a ton. So yeah, you're usually okay. But yeah, good question, because you're obviously weakening something else. Same kind of thing with ACLs. One of the ways they used to do it is they actually take out part of your patellar tendon, but then it weakens the tendon. You tend to get inflammation, and then sometimes people would have like patellar tendon problems. So they don't do that as often anymore. All right, radial ulnar joints. So you have two radial ulnar joints, proximal and distal. So the proximal radial ulnar joint is what we've already been talking about as far as the interaction between the radial head and then that radial notch on the ulna. So that's your proximal radial ulnar joint. And again, that's inside of the elbow joint capsule. And then the distal radial ulnar joint's down here. So it's at the wrist. So it's that intersection between the radius and the ulna down here. And one of the interesting things about that, so the ulna basically stays put, and the radius flips over or spins around it. And so you can see that on the left, this is the forearm, right forearm in supination. And then on the right is pronation. So they just flip their hand over. So again, the ulna stays put, and then the radius just flips over the top of it. They kind of form an X when you're in pronation. It's easier to see if you get to play with the skeletons on Thursday. You can spin their little radial ulnar joints and you can flip their hand over. It makes it easier to visualize. So supination and pronation occur there. And we already talked about the annular ligament. So the important thing I want you to know here, supination and pronation occur at the radial ulnar joints, which is abbreviated RU through the rest of the slide. All right, so let's talk muscles. So now we're on the Lab 4 sheet at the top, doing the elbow complex muscles. The good news is you should already have all this stuff. Right, so we're talking about biceps brachii, because we're talking about biceps at the shoulder. The biceps is obviously also active in the forearm and at the elbow. So biceps, same origin, same insertion. So originates long head, supraglenoid tubercle, short head, coracoid process, both come together, insert in the tuberosity of the radius. And then, so biceps at the glenohumeral joint, which is your shoulder, we know it's a flexor. It's also a flexor at the humeral ulnar joint, so again, primary hinge joint of the elbow. And then it's a supinator at the radial ulnar joint. So flip your hand over. Biceps is actually the strongest supinator. So one of the things we talked about before were distal bicep tears where it pulls out of the tuberosity of the radius. It's actually one of the tests for that. If you're not sure if they've torn their biceps, and usually you are, but in case you're not, one of the tests for that is you basically have them in supination, and you say, okay, I want you to hold that position, and don't let me flip you over. And if their biceps is torn, it's going to be pretty easy for you to flip them back into pronation, because their strongest supinator is gone, and so they won't be able to hold that position. So like I said, it's usually pretty obvious they tore their biceps, but in case you wanted to test it, that's how you do it. So biceps, one of the big three elbow flexors. And then the other two are brachialis and brachioradialis. All right.
Someone like distally turns his bicep a lot of times, it will like roll up into your arm, just like if you were Achilles tendon.
Yep. Not like a ton, but like it won't have that V shape anymore. It just kind of goes flat. So yeah.
If you like put them next to each other, like you could usually tell.
You could, yeah. It's referred to as an obvious deformity. And so you can like, oh, look at that thing. That doesn't look right. So that's your obvious deformity. Yeah. Yeah, good question. All right, so deep to biceps. Now you got brachialis. So you can see brachialis originates on the anterior shaft of the humerus, inserts onto the coronoid process and also onto the tuberosity of the ulna. And so it is only a flexor at the humeral ulnar joint. So another thing to know is that if a muscle inserts onto the radius, it can cause pronation supination. But if a muscle inserts onto the ulna, it can't affect that. So because brachialis then inserts onto the ulna, it's only an elbow flexor. And then our last big elbow flexor is brachioradialis. So like I said, because people are still writing, brachialis is deep to biceps. It's one, you can see it. So if you look at the lateral aspect of somebody's arm, if they flex, biceps is typically pretty obvious, and then brachialis is kind of in the middle of their arm there on the lateral aspect. So it's just underneath it. All right, and then our last one, the big elbow flexors, is brachioradialis. So as mentioned before, it originates on that lateral supracondylar ridge. It actually runs the length of the forearm and inserts distally at the styloid of the radius. So it runs way down here and inserts at the styloid of the radius. So brachioradialis is a flexor of the humeral ulnar joint, but because it inserts onto the radius, and because of the orientation between its origin and insertion, it's an assister with both supination and pronation. The brachioradialis is a pretty active muscle. It's also one, when we get to the forearm muscles, I'll show you how to find your superficial layer of forearm muscles, and brachioradialis is actually an important starting point. So brachioradialis is one that you can find if you flex your elbow to 90 degrees and then just try to keep it there and push down with your other arm. You'll see a little muscle pop up on the top. That's your brachioradialis. So that's that one right there. And so when we find our forearm muscles, we'll just go off of it and kind of slide down toward our pinky, and then we'll find all of our forearm muscles, or our superficial forearm muscles. So today's bodybuilding tip of the day, you're going to go to the weight room after this. So biceps is in the best position when the forearm is in supination. So when you're doing elbow flexion exercises or pulling exercises like pull-ups, if you're in supination, biceps has the best advantage there. Because if you flip your hand over to pronation, now you've lengthened biceps out distally. And so remember we talked about length tension curves last time. You've changed its length tension curve. So biceps isn't as strong with the forearm in pronation. So if you want to work biceps the most, supination. And if you want to work brachioradialis, because again, it's that one that's right here, do it with your thumbs up. So brachioradialis is in the best position when you do hammer curls. When your thumbs are up, that's primarily brachioradialis. And then if you flip over into pronation, now brachioradialis, not in a good position, biceps not in a good position, so the primary elbow flexor is brachialis. So brachialis, if you do reverse curls, that's the one that you're primarily using. Because brachialis is an elbow flexor no matter your forearm position, because it inserts on the ulna. So it's most active, it contributes the most to elbow flexion if you are in pronation. And so also if you're doing a sideline test for somebody's elbow flexors, basically if you're testing biceps, you test them with a forearm in supination, brachioradialis with thumbs up, and then brachialis with their forearm in pronation. So that's how those work. Triceps brachii, another one you already have. So same origin and insertion as before, except now we know where the electron is. So again, the long head is an extensor at the glenohumeral joint, and then all three heads, medial, lateral, and long, are extensors at the humeral ulnar joint, which again is your elbow. So you can see highlighted there is the long head, but again, so long head's highlighted, lateral head's here, and then the medial head, remember we had to actually like take these two off, but it kind of peeks out over here. So there's your medial head there, and there's a little bit of medial head there. triceps then. Triceps is obviously your primary elbow extensor. It has an assister, but it is your primary elbow extensor by a lot. So long head, glenohumeral extension, short head, humeral ulnar extension. And then its assister is one called Anconeus. So Anconeus is one, and I mean, it's so small you almost can't see it highlighted here. So Anconeus is this little guy right there. And when we get to the lab, for whatever reason, if you use the keys for the plastic arms, they call it cubitalis riolani or something like that. And that's the only place I've ever seen it that. But anyway, so that's your Anconeus. So you can see the origin there. Lateral epicondyle humerus inserts onto the lateral aspect of the olecranon. And so it is also an extensor of the humeral ulnar joint. But as you can imagine, it's such a tiny little muscle with a tiny little belly. It's not very strong. So your primary extensor is the triceps brachii. So then you got three primary elbow flexors, biceps brachii, or sorry, I should say humeral ulnar flexors, biceps brachii, brachialis and brachioradialis, and then two primary extensors, and those are triceps brachii and Anconeus. And then should get into, I think, pronators and supinators. All right, so that's what I just said. Okay, so we got three additional muscles. So you got Pronator Teres. So Pronator Teres is one that originates from that medial epicondyle of the humerus and starts kind of halfway down on the radius. Has a pretty non-specific insertion, as you can see there. So lateral radius distal to the insertion of this, distal to the insertion of the supinator muscle. So not a very distinct insertion point. But Pronator Teres, as you would imagine, is a pronator, and it's also a weak flexor of the humeral ulnar joint. So flip your hand over. Pronator Teres is a pretty important little stabilizer muscle at the elbow. So related to what we were talking about with Tommy John surgery and UCL injuries, one of the things that you'll have pitchers end up doing to try to prevent UCL injuries or to try to strengthen and recover afterwards is they'll do a lot of like resisted pronation, supination, but especially pronation, because when the forearm is in pronation, then Pronator Teres is contracting, and that helps stabilize that medial aspect of the elbow, take some load off of the UCL. So something else I was going to tell you about that. Oh, that was the other thing. So pitchers, if you're a baseball fan, one of the things that you're probably aware of is that something like throwing a fastball where the forearm is in pronation, that's one of the less dangerous pitches as opposed to throwing a curveball where you're kind of in that thumbs up neutral position. That's a pitch that's more likely to cause damage to the medial aspect of the elbow. And the reason for that is because if you flip your forearm into kind of that neutral position, now you lengthen out Pronator Teres, so it can't contribute quite as much to protection on the inside of the elbow. So you expose the UCL a little bit more when you throw curveballs as opposed to when your forearm's in pronation with fastballs. Then we got Pronator Quadratus. Try and get through these last two before we call it a day. So Pronator Quadratus is distal. And I'll find all these for you next time. I'll show you where they all are. So you see anterior surface of the distal ulna to the anterior surface of the distal radius. And all it's going to do is pronation. It's going to flip the radius over the ulna distally. And you can see it's also a stabilizer of the joint. But its real job is pronation. So two pronators, one proximal, Pronator Teres, one distal, Pronator Quadratus. And then our last muscle is supinator. So supinator has pretty big origin, but the primary part of it originates from the lateral epicondyle. And it's going to insert onto the radius. Again, fairly non-distinct insertion. And while we're on here, supinator is actually pictured here too. So this is supinator up here. All right, so then supinator, you can see the origin there. Inserts on the lateral third of the proximal radius, and then does supination. So at the radial ulnar joints then, you've got biceps brachii and supinator are your primary two supinators. And then Pronator Teres and Pronator And that is it for the elbow. So those are all your elbow muscles. And then, so next time, we'll talk about the bones of the forearm and wrist. And obviously we already covered the radius and the ulna pretty extensively, so we're mostly going to cover like wrist and hand bones, I guess. And then we'll start to get into some of the little wrist flexors and wrist extensors and those muscles. So we will see y'all on Wednesday for that.